The tranquil beach quickly turned into a nightmare when something brushed against a leg under the water. A moment later, a force like a freight train struck from below, dragging everything into the depths. Panic filled the lungs, and the salty taste of the ocean mixed with the metallic tang of blood. The creature circled in the murk, unseen but unmistakably near. The realization hit like a second attack. Escape was impossible. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The pre-dawn light crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange as Jake Miller pulled into the parking lot at Monterey State Beach. At 25, he was in the prime of his swimming career, his lean, muscular body honed by years of training in both pools and open water. Today was no different. Another day, another training session. But as he stepped out of his car, the cool morning air carried a hint of foreboding that made him shiver slightly. Jake grabbed his gear bag from the trunk, slamming it shut with a resounding thud that echoed across the nearly empty lot. As he made his way towards the beach, he noticed a figure in the lifeguard tower, silhouetted against the brightening sky. It was unusual to see someone there this early, and curiosity got the better of him. "Morning," Jake called out, raising a hand in greeting. "You're up early." The figure turned, revealing the weathered face of Tom, one of the senior lifeguards. "Jake, that you?" Tom's voice carried a note of concern. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here this early." Jake approached the tower, his bare feet sinking into the cool sand. "Yeah, just getting in some extra training. Big meet coming up next month." Tom's brow furrowed as he climbed down from his perch. "Listen, Jake, I know you're dedicated and all, but you might want to reconsider swimming today." A knot formed in Jake's stomach. "Why's that? Weather looks perfect to me." Tom sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "We've had some sightings recently. Great whites. More than usual for this time of year." Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but he quickly pushed the feeling aside. He'd swum with sharks before. It was part of the risk of open water swimming. "Thanks for the heads up, Tom. But you know me. I've dealt with sharks before. I'll keep close to shore." Tom's expression darkened. "This isn't like before, Jake. These sightings are different. The sharks are more aggressive, coming closer to the beaches. We've had to close some areas further down the coast." For a moment, Jake hesitated. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to listen, to pack up and head to the pool instead. But the competitor in him, the part that thrived on pushing limits and facing fears, won out. "I appreciate the warning, Tom. Really, I do. But I can't afford to miss this training session. I promise I'll be careful." Jake's tone was firm, brooking no argument. Tom shook his head, a mix of frustration and resignation on his face. "Your funeral, kid. Just don't go out too far. All right? And if you see anything at all, you get your ass back to shore faster than you've ever swum before. Got it?" Jake nodded, forcing a smile. "Got it. Thanks, Tom." As he walked away, Jake could feel Tom's eyes boring into his back. He pushed the uneasy feeling aside, focusing instead on his pre-swim routine. He dropped his bag on the sand and began his stretches, the familiar motions helping to calm his nerves. The beach was deserted, save for a few early morning joggers and a couple walking their dog in the distance. The ocean stretched out before him, calm and inviting, its surface barely rippled by the gentle offshore breeze. It was hard to imagine danger lurking beneath those peaceful waters. As Jake went through his stretches, he couldn't shake Tom's warning from his mind. He'd always respected the ocean, knew its power and the creatures that called it home. But he'd also always felt at home in the water, as if it were a part of him. The thought of staying away, of letting fear dictate his actions, was almost physically painful. "You've got this, Jake," he muttered to himself, bouncing lightly on his toes. "Just another day, just another swim." He glanced back towards the lifeguard tower. Tom was still there, watching. Jake raised a hand in acknowledgement, then turned back to face the water. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the salty air, and began his approach to the water's edge. The first touch of the Pacific sent a shock through his system. It was colder than he'd expected, and for a moment, His resolve wavered. But then muscle memory kicked in, and he pushed forward, diving beneath an incoming wave with practiced ease. The world transformed as Jake submerged. The sounds of the beach faded away, replaced by the muffled roar of water in his ears. He surfaced, gasping slightly at the cold, and began his warm-up strokes parallel to the shore. As he swam, Jake's mind wandered to the creatures that might be sharing the water with him. He'd encountered sharks before during open water swims, mostly smaller species that kept their distance. But great whites were different. They were apex predators, perfectly evolved killing machines. The thought sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the water temperature. After about 10 minutes of warm-up, Jake paused, treading water as he surveyed his surroundings. The shore seemed further away than he'd realized, the beach a thin strip of gold in the distance. He could just make out Tom's figure in the lifeguard tower, a tiny speck against the brightening sky. It was then that he noticed the seals. A small group of them were bobbing in the water maybe 100 yards further out, their sleek heads visible above the waves. Jake felt a surge of excitement. He'd always loved watching seals during his swims, admiring their grace and playfulness in the water. Without fully realizing it, Jake began to swim towards them. His strokes were strong and sure, cutting through the water with practiced efficiency. The seals grew larger as he approached, and he could hear their barks carried on the wind. It wasn't until he paused again to catch his breath that Jake realized how far he'd come. The shore was now a distant line on the horizon, the lifeguard tower barely visible. A tendril of fear wormed its way into his gut as Tom's warnings echoed in his mind. "Shit," Jake muttered, treading water as he considered his options. He knew he should head back immediately, but part of him was reluctant to cut his training short. He was already out here. After all, maybe just a few more minutes. It was then that he saw it, a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, gone almost before he could register it. Jake spun in the water, heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The surface of the ocean was calm, undisturbed save for his own movements. "Get a grip," he told himself, trying to calm his racing pulse. It was probably just a fish, or your imagination. But as Jake began to swim back toward shore, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow in the water, every ripple on the surface, seemed to hide potential danger. His powerful strokes took on a frantic edge as the distance to safety seemed to stretch endlessly before him. And somewhere beneath the surface, unbeknownst to Jake, a great white shark began to circle. Its black eyes, cold and alien, fixed on the thrashing figure above. Driven by instinct and hunger, it began its silent approach, the calm before the storm was over. The hunt had begun. Jake's powerful strokes cut through the water with practiced efficiency, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the gentle swells of the Pacific. The sun, now fully risen, cast a golden glow across the surface of the ocean, creating a dazzling display of light that would have been beautiful if Jake had taken the time to notice. But his mind was focused solely on his training, counting strokes and monitoring his breathing as he pushed himself to maintain a steady pace. As he swam parallel to the shore, Jake couldn't shake the lingering unease from his earlier conversation with Tom. The lifeguard's warnings about increased shark activity echoed in his mind, causing him to scan the water around him more frequently than usual. Yet with each passing minute without incident, his confidence grew, and the thrill of open water swimming began to overshadow his initial concerns. After about 20 minutes of steady swimming, Jake paused to catch his breath and get his bearings. As he treaded water, he noticed a group of seals in the distance, their sleek bodies glistening in the morning sun as they frolicked in the waves. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he watched their playful antics. "Now that's something you don't see every day," Jake murmured to himself, momentarily forgetting his earlier apprehension. Without fully realizing it, Jake began to swim towards the seals, drawn by their graceful movements and the rare opportunity to observe them up close. With each stroke, the shore became a thinner line on the horizon, but Jake was too focused on his impromptu goal to notice. As he drew closer to the seal group, Jake could hear their distinctive barks carried on the breeze. The sound filled him with a sense of wild joy, reminding him why he loved open water swimming so much. It wasn't just about the training or the competition. It was about moments like these, feeling connected to the vast, untamed nature of the ocean. Jake slowed his pace as he approached the seals, not wanting to startle them. He treaded water about 50 yards away, watching in awe as the animals dove and surfaced with effortless grace. It was then that a sobering thought struck him. Where there were seals, there might also be sharks. A chill ran down Jake's spine that had nothing to do with the cool water. He glanced back towards the shore, his stomach dropping as he realized just how far he'd swum. The beach was now a thin, hazy line in the distance, the lifeguard tower barely visible. "Shit," Jake muttered, a surge of panic rising in his chest. What the hell was I thinking? He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Panic wouldn't help him now. He needed to stay focused and get back to shore as quickly and calmly as possible. As Jake began to swim back, his strokes more urgent than before, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow in the water, every unexpected splash, sent a jolt of fear through him. He tried to rationalize his fears, reminding himself that shark attacks were rare, but Tom's warnings kept replaying in his mind. After several minutes of hard swimming, Jake paused again to catch his breath and check his progress. To his dismay, the shore didn't seem any closer. If anything, the current appeared to be pushing him further out to sea. A wave of exhaustion washed over him as the realization of his predicament set in. "Come on, Jake," he panted, treading water. "You've trained for this. You can do it." Just as he was about to resume swimming, a dark shape moved swiftly beneath him, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Jake's heart leaped into his throat, his body freezing in terror. "No, no, no," he whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the water. "It's nothing. It has to be nothing." But deep down, Jake knew what he had seen. The sleek, powerful shape was unmistakable. A shark, and a big one at that. Panic set in, overriding all of Jake's training and experience. He began to swim frantically towards the shore, his strokes wild and uncoordinated. Water splashed around him as he thrashed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Help!" he shouted, knowing full well that no one could hear him from this distance. "Somebody help me." As Jake swam, the rational part of his brain fought to regain control. He knew his panicked movements were only making him more noticeable, more like wounded prey. With a monumental effort, he forced himself to slow down, to try and regulate his breathing and smooth out his strokes. But the damage was done. Below the surface, the great white shark had locked onto Jake's erratic movements. Driven by instinct and curiosity, it began to circle closer, drawn by the vibrations of Jake's panicked swimming. Jake felt a rush of water behind him as the shark passed nearby, its massive body displacing the water around it. He choked back a scream, his limbs feeling like lead as terror threatened to overwhelm him. "Stay calm," he gasped to himself. "Just keep swimming. Don't look back." But the urge to look was irresistible. Jake turned his head, his blood turning to ice as he spotted the shark's dorsal fin breaking the surface, heading straight for him. In a desperate attempt to throw off the predator, Jake changed direction, angling away from the approaching fin. His muscles burned with exertion, every fiber of his being focused on escape. The shark disappeared from view, leaving Jake terrified and unsure of its location. He continued to swim, pushing through the growing exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Come on," Jake muttered through gritted teeth. "Just a little further. You can make it." But as he swam, Jake's strokes became slower, less coordinated. The adrenaline that had fueled his initial burst of speed was wearing off, leaving him drained and vulnerable. The shore still seemed impossibly far away, a cruel mirage that never grew closer no matter how hard he swam. Jake's mind raced, recalling everything he'd ever learned about shark encounters. Stay calm. Don't splash. Make yourself look big. But in the open water, miles from shore, none of that seemed to matter. He was alone, exhausted, and at the mercy of one of nature's most perfect predators. As he paused once again to catch his breath, Jake scanned the water around him. The surface was calm, deceptively peaceful, but he knew the shark was out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Please," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, just let me make it back." But the ocean, vast and indifferent, offered no response. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for the long swim ahead. He knew his chances were slim, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. With renewed determination, Jake began to swim again, his strokes measured and deliberate. He focused on each movement, each breath, trying to conserve his energy for the arduous journey ahead. Unknown to Jake, his struggle had not gone entirely unnoticed. Back on the beach, Tom had been watching the distant speck that was Jake through his binoculars. The experienced lifeguard's instincts told him something was wrong, and he had already radioed for backup in a rescue boat. As Jake fought his solitary battle against exhaustion and fear, help was on the way. But would it arrive in time? The great white, driven by millions of years of evolution and the primal urge to feed, continued its silent patrol beneath the waves. The allure of the open water had turned into a nightmare, and Jake Miller's fight for survival was only just beginning. Jake's arms felt like lead as he continued to push through the water, each stroke a monumental effort. The sun, now high in the sky, high in the, beat down mercilessly, its reflection on the water's surface nearly blinding him. He'd lost all sense of time. His world narrowed down to the endless cycle of stroke, breathe, stroke. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him as Jake finally allowed himself to pause, treading water as he gasped for air. His lungs burned and his muscles screamed in protest at the slightest movement. The shore was still distressingly far away, a thin line of gold barely visible on the horizon. "Come on, Jake," he panted, trying to psych himself up. "You can do this. Just a little further." But even as the words left his mouth, Jake knew he was in serious trouble. He'd pushed himself too far, too fast in his panic, and now he was paying the price. The current seemed to be working against him, pulling him further out to sea with each passing moment. As Jake floated, catching his breath, a chilling realization crept over him. The water around him had become eerily still. The gentle lapping of waves against his body had ceased, replaced by an unnatural calm. It was as if the entire ocean was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake's heart began to race, his eyes darting frantically across the water's surface. He'd heard stories from other open water swimmers about this phenomenon, the calm before a shark attack. But surely it couldn't be happening to him, not now, not when he was so close to. His thoughts were violently interrupted as a massive dark shape surged upward from the depths, mere feet away from where he treaded water. Jake's scream caught in his throat as he caught a glimpse of a row of razor-sharp teeth and a black, lifeless eye rolling back in its head. The great white shark breached the surface in a spectacular display of power, its enormous body clearing the water entirely, before crashing back down with a thunderous splash. Jake was buffeted by the resulting wave, choking on seawater as he struggled to keep his head above the surface. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," Jake gasped, his body shaking uncontrollably. The shark had disappeared beneath the waves as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Jake terrified and unsure of its location. In that moment, all of Jake's training and experience seemed to evaporate. Panic took hold, overriding every rational thought. He began to swim wildly, his strokes frenzied and uncoordinated, driven by pure animalistic fear. "Help!" he screamed, knowing full well that no one could hear him. "Somebody help me!" But his cries were swallowed by the vast, uncaring ocean. Jake was alone, trapped in a nightmare that was all too real. As he swam, Jake felt a rush of water behind him. He turned his head, his blood turning to ice as he saw the shark's dorsal fin cutting through the water, heading straight for him. It was impossibly large, at least 3 feet tall, slicing through the waves with terrifying speed and purpose. Jake's mind raced, recalling everything he'd ever learned about shark encounters. Stay calm. Don't splash. Make yourself look big. But in the open water, miles from shore, none of that seemed to matter. He was alone, exhausted, and at the mercy of one of nature's most perfect predators. In a desperate attempt to evade the approaching shark, Jake changed direction, angling away from the fin. His muscles burned with exertion, every fiber of his being focused on escape. But as he swam, he could feel the shark's presence behind him, an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to radiate through the water. Suddenly, the fin disappeared from view. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized he'd lost sight of the predator. He slowed his frantic pace, treading water as he spun in circles, trying to locate the shark. "Where are you?" he muttered, his voice trembling. "Where the hell are you?" The answer came in the form of a massive shape materializing beneath him. Jake caught a glimpse of gray, sandpaper-like skin as the shark brushed against his legs, its rough hide scraping against his skin. He choked back a scream, his body rigid with terror. Time seemed to stand still as Jake floated there, the shark circling beneath him. He knew that great whites often investigated potential prey before attacking, bumping and probing to determine if it was worth eating. But knowing this did little to calm his frayed nerves. "Please," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, just go away." But the shark, driven by millions of years of evolution and the primal urge to feed, had no interest in Jake's pleas. It continued to circle, each pass bringing it closer to the surface, closer to Jake's vulnerable body. As Jake treaded water, he became acutely aware of how exposed he was. His black wetsuit designed to keep him warm in the cool Pacific waters now seemed like a cruel joke. To the shark, he must look like a seal. The great white's preferred prey. Jake's mind raced, considering his options. He could try to swim for shore, but he knew he'd never make it before exhaustion overtook him. He could try to fight if the shark attacked, but against a creature that could grow up to 20 feet long and weigh over 5,000 pounds. What chance did he really have? As these thoughts whirled through his head, Jake felt another brush against his legs. This time it was unmistakably the shark's snout, bumping against him with frightening precision. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he felt the unmistakable texture of the shark's ampullae of Lorenzini, the electroreceptor organs that allowed it to sense the faint electrical fields produced by its prey's muscular movements. "No, no, no," Jake muttered, his body trembling uncontrollably. He knew what was coming next. The bump was often followed by a bite, as the shark tried to determine if its potential prey was worth eating. In that moment, as Jake floated helplessly in the vast ocean, a strange calm settled over him. Time seemed to slow, his senses sharpening to a razor's edge. He could hear the gentle lapping of waves, feel the coolness of the water against his skin, see the play of sunlight on the surface with startling clarity. And then, without warning, the attack came. Jake felt a tremendous force slam into his legs, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He was dragged underwater, disoriented and struggling to comprehend what was happening. In the murky depths, he caught a glimpse of the shark's massive form, its jaws clamped firmly around his left calf. Pain exploded through Jake's body as the shark's teeth tore into his flesh. He thrashed wildly, driven by pure survival instinct, his fists pounding against the shark's tough hide. Bubbles obscured his vision as he fought, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. In a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, Jake remembered something he'd read about shark attacks. The eyes and the gills, those were the vulnerable spots. With the last of his strength, he drove his thumb into the shark's eye, pressing with all his might. The effect was immediate. The shark's jaws loosened, and Jake felt himself being released. He kicked hard, ignoring the searing pain in his leg as he propelled himself towards the surface. Jake broke through the waves with a desperate gasp, sucking air into his burning lungs. Blood clouded the water around him, and he knew he had only moments before the shark returned to finish what it had started. "Help!" he screamed, his voice hoarse and broken. "Somebody please help me!" But as Jake scanned the horizon, he saw no sign of rescue. The shore was still impossibly far away, and the vast ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. He was alone, injured, and facing an enemy that had evolved over millions of years to be the perfect killing machine. As the shock began to wear off, the pain in Jake's leg intensified. He looked down, his stomach churning at the sight of the mangled flesh. The shark's teeth had torn through his wetsuit, leaving deep, jagged wounds that bled freely into the water. Jake knew he had to move. The blood would only attract more sharks, and staying still made him an easy target. With a groan of pain, he began to swim, each stroke sending waves of agony through his body. But even as he swam, Jake could sense the shark's presence. It was out there, circling, waiting for another opportunity to strike. The question wasn't if it would attack again, but when. As Jake struggled against exhaustion, pain, and terror, he couldn't help but think of the shore. of safety, so tantalizingly close yet impossibly far away. He thought of Tom, the lifeguard who had warned him, of his family and friends who might never know what happened to him. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, tears mixing with the salt water on his face. "I'm so sorry." But the ocean, vast and indifferent, offered no response. Jake Miller's fight for survival was far from over, and the great white shark, driven by instinct and hunger, continued its silent, deadly patrol beneath the waves. Jake's world had narrowed to a singular focus: survival. Each stroke was agony, the salt water stinging his wounds as he pushed through the waves. The shore remained a distant mirage, seemingly no closer despite his desperate efforts. Blood trailed behind him in the water, a crimson beacon that he knew would only attract more predators. "Keep moving," Jake gasped to himself, his breath coming in ragged pants. "Don't stop, don't you dare stop." But even as he urged himself on, Jake could feel his strength ebbing. The initial surge of adrenaline from the attack was wearing off, leaving him shaky and weak. The pain in his leg had intensified to a burning throb that threatened to overwhelm him with each kick. Suddenly, a rush of water behind him sent a jolt of terror through Jake's body. He turned his head, his heart nearly stopping as he saw the shark's dorsal fin cutting through the waves, heading straight for him. It was impossibly fast, eating up the distance between them with frightening speed. "No, no, no," Jake muttered, panic giving him a fresh burst of energy. He increased his pace, his arms windmilling frantically as he tried to put distance between himself and the approaching predator. But it was a futile effort. The great white, perfectly evolved for speed and power in the water, was quickly gaining on him. Jake could feel the displacement of water as the massive creature passed beneath him, its rough skin brushing against his legs. In a desperate attempt to evade the shark, Jake changed direction, veering sharply to the right. It was a move born of pure instinct, a last-ditch effort to throw off his pursuer. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed to work. The shark's fin disappeared from view, leaving Jake treading water in a small circle of calm. "Where are you?" Jake whispered, his eyes darting frantically across the surface of the water. The sudden absence of the shark was almost more terrifying than seeing it approach. At least when he could see the fin, he knew where the danger was coming from. The answer came in the form of a massive shape materializing beneath him. Jake caught a glimpse of the shark's pale underbelly as it rose from the depths, its mouth opening to reveal rows of serrated teeth. Time seemed to slow. Jake could see every detail with startling clarity. The black, lifeless eye rolling back in its head, the scars that crisscrossed its snout, the smaller fish that darted away from the approaching predator. In that moment, Jake realized the true meaning of terror. With a surge of desperate strength, Jake kicked hard, propelling himself to the side just as the shark breached the surface. The great white's jaws snapped shut on empty water, missing Jake by mere inches. The splash as it crashed back into the ocean sent Jake tumbling, disoriented and gasping for air. "Help!" Jake screamed as he surfaced, his voice hoarse and broken. "Somebody, please! Help me!" But his cries were swallowed by the vast, uncaring ocean. Jake was alone in his struggle, facing a predator that had been honed by millions of years of evolution into the perfect killing machine. As Jake struggled to regain his bearings, he became aware of a new sound cutting through the air. It was faint at first, barely audible over the lapping of waves and his own ragged breathing. But it was growing louder by the second. A helicopter. Hope surged through Jake's chest as he spotted the aircraft approaching from the direction of the shore. It was still far off, but closing fast. Someone had noticed his absence. Someone was looking for him. "Here!" Jake shouted, waving his arms frantically above his head. "I'm here, help!" But even as Jake called out, he knew the danger was far from over. The shark was still out there circling, waiting for another opportunity to strike. And now, with the helicopter's thunderous approach, the water around Jake was churning with agitated sea life. The great white's fin broke the surface again, this time circling Jake in a tightening spiral. Jake could see the intelligence in its movements, the calculated patience of an apex predator. It was hurting him, cutting off any possible avenue of escape. "Come on," Jake muttered, his eyes darting between the approaching helicopter and the circling shark. "Just a little closer." Please, just a little closer." The helicopter was near enough now that Jake could make out the Coast Guard insignia on its side. He could see figures leaning out, scanning the water. But would they spot him in time? Suddenly, the shark changed tactics. Instead of circling, it charged straight at Jake, its dorsal fin slicing through the water like a knife. Jake had only seconds to react. Drawing on every ounce of strength he had left, he dove beneath the surface, kicking hard to propel himself under the oncoming predator. The water around Jake exploded into a frenzy of bubbles and thrashing limbs as the shark passed overhead. He felt the rough skin of its underbelly scrape against his back, tearing his wetsuit and leaving angry red welts on his skin. Jake surfaced with a desperate gasp, his lungs burning as he sucked in air. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its downdraft whipping the sea into a frenzy of white-capped waves. "Here!" Jake screamed, waving his arms. "I'm here!" A spotlight from the helicopter swept across the water, illuminating Jake in its harsh glare. He saw a figure lean out of the aircraft, gesturing wildly. They had spotted him, but the shark wasn't done. As Jake treaded water, waiting for rescue, he felt a sudden, powerful tug on his right leg. The great white had attacked from below, its jaws clamping down on his calf with bone-crushing force. Pain exploded through Jake's body as he was dragged beneath the surface. In the murky depths, he could see the shark's massive form, its body twisting as it tried to tear away a chunk of flesh. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but Jake fought it back. He knew that if he lost control now, it would be the end. With the last of his strength, Jake aimed a punch at the shark's sensitive nose. His fist connected with a solid thud, and miraculously, the pressure on his leg eased. The shark released him, momentarily stunned by the unexpected attack. Jake kicked hard, ignoring the searing pain in his leg as he propelled himself towards the surface. He broke through the waves with a desperate gasp, his vision blurring as he fought to stay conscious. The helicopter was lower now, a rescue diver already descending on a cable. Jake could hear shouts from above, urging him to hold on, to stay afloat for just a few moments longer. But the shark wasn't finished. Jake felt the water displace behind him as the great white made another pass. He turned, coming face to face with the predator as it rose from the depths, its jaws open wide. Time seemed to stand still. Jake could see every detail of the shark's mouth. The rows of serrated teeth, the dark void of its throat, the scars on its snout from countless battles. He was looking death in the face, and in that moment, a strange calm settled over him. Just as the shark was about to strike, a hand grasped Jake's arm, yanking him roughly to the side. The rescue diver had reached him, pulling Jake out of the shark's path at the last possible second. "I've got you!" the diver shouted over the roar of the helicopter. "Hold on!" Jake clung to the diver with the last of his strength as they were winched upwards. Below them, the shark circled in frustrated rage, its prize snatched away at the last moment. As they were pulled into the helicopter, Jake finally allowed himself to believe that he might survive. The adrenaline that had kept him going began to ebb, and the full extent of his injuries made itself known. His vision swam, darkness creeping in at the edges. The last thing Jake saw before losing consciousness was the vast expanse of the Pacific stretching out below, the sun glinting off its surface. Somewhere in those depths, the great white shark continued its silent patrol, an apex predator in its natural habitat. Indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded, the chase was over, but Jake's ordeal was far from finished. As the helicopter sped towards the shore, carrying its battered and bloodied passenger, the real struggle was just beginning. The rhythmic thrum of the helicopter's rotors faded into the background as Jake drifted in and out of consciousness. His body, battered and in shock, struggled to process the trauma it had endured. Flashes of memory, the shark's black eye, rows of serrated teeth, the taste of blood and salt water, haunted his semi-conscious state. "Stay with us, buddy," a voice cut through the haze. It was the rescue diver, his face a mask of concern as he worked to stem the blood flow from Jake's mangled leg. "We're almost there, just hang on." Jake tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat. The pain, held at bay by adrenaline and shock, was starting to make itself known with brutal intensity. Every movement, every breath, sent waves of agony through his body. The helicopter banked sharply, and Jake felt a surge of nausea. He turned his head, catching a glimpse of the coastline through the open door. The beach, which had seemed so distant and unreachable during his ordeal, was now rushing towards them at breakneck speed. "ETA 2 minutes," the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Medical team standing by on the ground. The diver nodded, then turned back to Jake. "You hear that? We're almost home. Just stay awake for me, okay?" Jake managed a weak nod, fighting against the darkness that threatened to engulf him. He focused on the diver's face, using it as an anchor to stay conscious. Suddenly, a jolt of pain shot through Jake's body, more intense than anything he had experienced before. He cried out, his back arching off the floor of the helicopter. "What's happening?" the co-pilot shouted, turning in his seat. The diver's face paled as he pulled back the makeshift bandage on Jake's leg. "The tourniquet's not holding, we're losing him." Time seemed to slow as Jake felt his life ebbing away. The voices around him became muffled, as if he were underwater again. In his mind's eye, he saw the shark, its massive form gliding effortlessly through the water, circling closer and closer. "No," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rotors. "Not like this." With a monumental effort, Jake forced his eyes open. The interior of the helicopter swam into focus, the faces of the rescue team etched with worry and concentration. "I'm not done yet," Jake gasped, each word a struggle. The diver looked up, surprise and admiration flashing across his face. "That's it. Fight. We're touching down now. Stay with us." The helicopter descended rapidly, the beach growing larger in the open door. Jake could see a crowd gathered on the sand, emergency vehicles, their lights flashing, and a team of medical personnel standing ready. As soon as the helicopter's skids touched the ground, it was a flurry of activity. The door was wrenched open, and Jake felt himself being lifted onto a stretcher. Male, mid-20s, severe lacerations to the left calf and right thigh. The diver rattled off to the waiting paramedics. Possible arterial bleeding, signs of hypovolemic shock. Jake was whisked away from the helicopter, the bright sunlight momentarily blinding him. He could hear shouts, the squeal of ambulance sirens, the general chaos of an emergency scene. But above it all, one voice cut through, familiar, filled with a mix of relief and horror. "Jake, oh my God, Jake!" It was Tom, the lifeguard who had warned him that morning. Jake turned his head, catching a glimpse of the older man's ashen face as he ran alongside the stretcher. "I'm sorry," Jake managed to croak out. "Should have listened." Tom shook his head, his eyes glistening. "Don't talk, kid. Just focus on staying alive, you hear me?" Jake was loaded into the back of an ambulance, the doors slamming shut behind him. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away what remained of his wetsuit, inserting IVs, attaching monitors. "BP's dropping," one of them called out. "We need to move now." The ambulance lurched into motion, its siren wailing as it sped towards the hospital. Jake felt himself drifting again, the pain in his leg now a distant throb. He knew he should be worried about this, but he couldn't seem to muster the energy. "Stay with us, Jake," a paramedic urged. Her face swimming in and out of focus. "Tell me about your swim. What made you go out so far?" Jake blinked, trying to concentrate. "Wanted to see the seals," he mumbled. "They were so beautiful." The paramedic nodded encouragingly. "That's good, Jake. Keep talking. What else did you see out there?" But Jake's mind was elsewhere, back in the water. He could feel the cool embrace of the ocean, the rhythmic motion of the waves, and then, cutting through his reverie, the unmistakable shape of the shark. "It was so big," Jake whispered, his eyes wide with remembered terror, like a submarine, but alive. "I've never felt so small." The paramedic exchanged a worried glance with her colleague. Jake's words were becoming more disjointed, his skin clammy and pale. "We're losing him," she muttered. "Push another unit of ONEG and increase the saline." Jake was only vaguely aware of the increased activity around him. The ambulance seemed to fade away, replaced by the vast expanse of the Pacific. He was back in the water, the shark circling closer and closer. In his delirium, Jake could see every detail of the great white with startling clarity. Its rough gray skin, the scars that crisscrossed its snout, the black, lifeless eye that rolled back as it opened its massive jaws. "No," Jake moaned, trying to swim away. But his limbs felt like lead, refusing to respond. Please, no. Jake! Stay with us, Jake! The paramedic's voice seemed to come from very far away. We're almost at the hospital, just hold on. But Jake couldn't hold on. The shark was too close, its jaws opening wide. He could see row upon row of serrated teeth, smell the creature's breath, an overwhelming stench of death and decay. With a final terrifying lunge, the shark struck. Jake felt its teeth sink into his flesh, tearing through muscle and bone. He screamed, the sound echoing in the confined space of the ambulance. He's seizing, a voice shouted. Get the crash cart ready. Jake's body convulsed, his back arching off the stretcher. The monitors attached to him erupted in a cacophony of alarms. Fib, starting compressions. The paramedic began CPR, her movements quick and precise. But Jake was beyond feeling it. In his mind, he was still in the ocean, locked in a life-or-death struggle with nature's perfect predator. The ambulance screeched to a halt, its back doors flying open. Jake was rushed into the emergency room, a team of doctors and nurses swarming around him. Shark attack victim, multiple lacerations, severe blood loss, a paramedic rattled off. A paramedic. He's been in and out of consciousness, went into VFib en route. The ER was a blur of activity. Jake was only vaguely aware of being transferred to a hospital bed, of voices shouting orders, of hands working frantically to save his life. Through it all, the shark remained. Its presence was a constant, terrifying companion, always just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike again. As the doctors fought to stabilize him, Jake teetered on the edge of consciousness. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, the sterile hospital room merging with the vast, unforgiving ocean. In this liminal space, Jake faced his greatest fear. The shark, a primal force of nature, circled ever closer. But this time, something was different. Jake no longer felt the overwhelming terror that had gripped him in the water. Instead, a strange calm settled over him. He looked the shark in the eye, seeing it not as a monster, but as a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. In that moment, Jake understood something fundamental about life, about survival, about the delicate balance of nature. I see you, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the beeping of the hospital machines. I understand now. And with that understanding came a surge of strength. Jake felt his heart begin to beat more strongly, his lungs expanding with a deep, life-affirming breath. The shark, as if acknowledging this shift, turned and swam away, disappearing into the depths of Jake's subconscious. In the hospital room, the frantic activity began to subside. The alarms quieted, replaced by the steady beep of a stabilizing heart rate. We've got him, a doctor announced, relief evident in her voice. He's stabilizing. As Jake drifted into a healing sleep, the last of the shark's presence faded away. He had faced death and emerged changed, but alive. The attack was over, but Jake's journey was far from finished. The road to recovery would be long and challenging, but he had taken the first, crucial step. He had survived. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the air as Jake slowly regained consciousness. His eyelids felt heavy, refusing to open at first. The sterile smell of disinfectant mingled with the metallic scent of blood, immediately triggering memories of his ordeal in the ocean. Jake, can you hear me? A gentle voice cut through the fog in his mind. With immense effort, Jake managed to open his eyes. The world slowly came into focus, revealing a concerned face hovering above him. It took him a moment to recognize Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency room physician, who had been part of the team that saved his life. Where am I? Jake croaked, his throat raw and painful. Dr. Chen's face softened with relief. You're in the ICU at Monterey Bay Hospital. You've been unconscious for 2 days. 2 days. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His last clear memory was of being in the ambulance, fighting for his life as the shark attack replayed in his mind over and over. The shark? Jake mumbled, a wave of panic washing over him. You're safe now, Doctor, Chen assured him, placing a comforting hand on his arm. The shark can't hurt you anymore. Jake tried to nod, but even that small movement sent shockwaves of pain through his body. He became acutely aware of the extent of his injuries. The throbbing in his legs, the tightness in his chest, the dull ache that seemed to permeate every inch of his being. "How bad is it?" he asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Dr. Chen's expression turned serious. "You sustained severe injuries, Jake. The shark's teeth caused significant damage to your left calf and right thigh. We had to perform emergency surgery to repair the damage and stop the bleeding." She paused, allowing Jake to process the information before continuing. "You lost a lot of blood. There was a moment when we almost lost you. But you fought hard. Your survival instincts are remarkable." Jake closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. The memory of the attack came flooding back. The initial strike, the frenzied struggle, the desperate swim for survival. Will I be able to swim again?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper, fear and hope warring in his voice. Dr. Chen hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's too early to say for certain. The damage was extensive, and you'll need multiple surgeries and intensive physical therapy. But given your physical condition before the attack and your determination, I wouldn't rule anything out." Jake nodded slowly, trying to come to terms with his new reality. The thought of never swimming again was almost as terrifying as the memory of the shark attack itself. As if sensing his distress, Dr. Chen changed the subject. "There's someone here who's been waiting to see you. Do you feel up to a visitor?" Before Jake could respond, a familiar voice called from the doorway. "Jake? Oh, thank God you're awake." Tom, the lifeguard who had warned him on the morning of the attack, rushed into the room. His weathered face was etched with a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "Tom," Jake managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry. I should have listened to you." Tom shook his head, pulling up a chair next to the bed. "Don't you dare apologize, kid. I'm just glad you're alive." He turned to Dr. Chen. "How's he doing, Doc?" As Dr. Chen updated Tom on Jake's condition, Jake found his mind drifting back to the ocean. He could almost feel the cool water against his skin, hear the gentle lapping of waves. But now, those once comforting sensations were tainted by the memory of terror, of pain, of the primal fear that had gripped him during the attack. "Jake?" Tom's voice snapped him back to reality. "You still with us, buddy?" Jake blinked, focusing on Tom's concerned face. "Yeah, sorry. I keep seeing it. The shark. It's like I'm still out there." Tom nodded sympathetically. "That's normal, Jake, what you went through. It's not something you just shake off, but you're not alone in this, you hear me? We're all here for you." As if on cue, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Jake's parents burst into the room, their faces a mix of worry and relief. "Jake!" his mother cried, rushing to his bedside. "Oh, my baby boy." For the next hour, the room was a flurry of activity. Jake's parents alternated between fussing over him and demanding updates from Dr. Chen. Tom recounted the rescue operation, his voice filled with admiration for Jake's resilience. Through it all, Jake found himself drifting in and out, the combination of pain medication and emotional exhaustion taking its toll. As visiting hours came to an end, and the room finally quieted, Jake found himself alone with his thoughts. The constant beeping of the heart monitor became a metronomic backdrop to his racing mind. He closed his eyes, trying to find some semblance of peace. But instead of darkness, he saw the ocean. The vast blue expanse that had once been his second home now loomed in his mind like a threat. In his mind's eye, Jake saw himself back in the water. The sun was shining, the waves gently lapping against his body as he swam. For a moment it was peaceful, familiar. Then, without warning, the scene changed. The water around him darkened, churning with unseen currents. Jake felt his heart rate spike, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. He knew what was coming. The shark appeared as if summoned by his fear. Its massive form glided effortlessly through the water, circling closer and closer. Jake tried to swim away, but his limbs felt leaden, refusing to cooperate. "No," Jake muttered, his body twitching in the hospital bed. "Not again. Please, not again." The shark's black, lifeless eye rolled back as it opened its enormous jaws. Jake could see every detail with horrifying clarity. The rows of serrated teeth, the scars on its snout, the dark void of its throat. Just as the shark was about to strike, Jake's eyes snapped open. He gasped for air, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. It was just a dream, he whispered to himself, trying to slow his breathing. You're safe. You're in the hospital. The shark can't hurt you anymore. But even as he said the words, Jake knew they weren't entirely true. The shark might not be able to physically harm him anymore, but its presence lingered in his mind, a specter that threatened to haunt his every waking moment. As the night wore on, Jake drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he closed his eyes, the ocean was waiting. Sometimes it was peaceful, reminding him of why he had fallen in love with swimming in the first place. But more often, it was a place of terror, with the shark always lurking just out of sight. In the early hours of the morning, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the hospital windows, Jake made a decision. He couldn't let the fear win. He had survived the attack. Now he had to survive the aftermath. When Dr. Chen arrived for her morning rounds, she found Jake awake and alert, a determined look in his eyes. "Good morning, Jake," she said, checking his vitals. "How are you feeling?" "I want to start physical therapy as soon as possible," Jake replied, his voice stronger than it had been the day before. "And I want to talk to someone about the nightmares." Dr. Chen nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I think we can arrange that. It won't be easy, Jake. The road to recovery is going to be long and challenging." "I know," Jake said, meeting her gaze steadily. "But I have to try. I can't let the shark take swimming away from me. I won't let it win." As Dr. Chen left to make the necessary arrangements, Jake turned his attention to the window. Outside, he could see a sliver of the ocean in the distance. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine, but he forced himself to keep looking. "You're just water," he murmured, as much to himself as to the distant sea. "And I'm not afraid of water. I won't let you take that away from me." Over the next few days, Jake's room became a hub of activity. Physical therapists came and went, working with him to maintain muscle tone and flexibility in his uninjured limbs. A trauma counselor visited daily, helping Jake process the attack and develop coping strategies for the nightmares that continued to plague him. Through it all, Jake pushed himself harder than he ever had before. Every small victory, wiggling his toes, sitting up in bed unassisted, making it through a night without waking in terror, felt monumental. A week after regaining consciousness, Jake received an unexpected visitor. Marine biologist Dr. Emma Rodriguez knocked tentatively on his door, her face a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine concern. "Mr. Miller, I'm Dr. Rodriguez from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. I was wondering if I could talk to you about your encounter." Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Come in, Dr. Rodriguez, and please call me Jake." As Dr. Rodriguez settled into the chair beside his bed, Jake braced himself for the conversation. Talking about the attack was still difficult, but he had learned that facing it head-on was better than trying to avoid it. "First, let me say how glad I am that you survived," Dr. Rodriguez began. "What you went through, it's every ocean swimmer's worst nightmare." Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "It was intense. I've never felt so helpless, so small." Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, her eyes alight with a mixture of sympathy and scientific curiosity. "Would you be willing to tell me about it? Any details you can remember could be incredibly valuable for our research." For the next hour, Jake recounted his experience in painstaking detail. He described the initial bump, the terrifying moment when he first saw the shark's fin, the frenzied struggle in the water. Dr. Rodriguez listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly allowing Jake to speak uninterrupted. As Jake finished his account, Dr. Rodriguez sat back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Thank you, Jake. I know that couldn't have been easy to relive." "It helps, actually," Jake admitted. "Talking about it makes it feel less like this big scary thing in my head and more like, I don't know, just something that happened." Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "That's a healthy way to look at it. And Jake, I want you to know something. What you experienced, as terrifying as it was, is incredibly rare. Shark attacks, especially by great whites, are not common occurrences." "Then why me?" Jake asked. The question that had been haunting him since the attack finally spilling out. Why did it happen to me? Sharks don't target humans specifically, Dr. Rodriguez explained gently. In most cases, attacks are a case of mistaken identity. The shark likely mistook you for a seal or sea lion, its natural prey. Jake absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with his memory of the attack. It felt so personal, like it was coming after me specifically. I understand, Dr. Rodriguez said, but it's important to remember that the shark was just behaving according to its instincts. It's not a monster, just a predator doing what predators do. As Dr. Rodriguez prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Jake, I know it might not feel like it now, but what you went through, what you're going through, it's making you stronger. Your survival instincts kicked in when you needed them most. Don't forget that. After she left, Jake lay back in his bed, mulling over their conversation. The shark in his mind had been transformed from a mindless killing machine into a creature simply following its nature. It didn't make the memory of the attack any less terrifying, but it did make it somehow more understandable. As night fell and the hospital quieted, Jake closed his eyes, bracing himself for the nightmares that had become a nightly occurrence. But this time, as the ocean materialized in his mind, something was different. The water was clear and calm, the sun glinting off its surface. And while the shark was still there, circling in the depths, it no longer felt like an immediate threat. Instead, it was simply part of the ocean ecosystem, as much a part of the environment as the fish and the coral. For the first time since the attack, Jake slept through the night without waking in terror. His survival instincts, which had saved his life in the water, were now helping him heal on dry land. The journey ahead would be long and challenging, but Jake was ready to face it head-on. As he drifted off to sleep, Jake's last conscious thought was of the ocean, not as a place of terror, but as the vast, beautiful, sometimes dangerous environment he had always loved. He would return to it one day, he promised himself, not out of bravado or a need to conquer his fears, but because it was a part of him. The shark had taken much from him, but it hadn't taken everything. His survival instincts, his love for the water, his determination to overcome, these were the things that defined Jake Miller. And no shark, no matter how fearsome, could ever take that away. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the Monterey Bay coastline erupted into a flurry of activity. The peaceful morning calm was shattered by the wail of sirens and the urgent chatter of radios. At the center of it all stood Tom, the veteran lifeguard, his weathered face etched with worry as he scanned the vast expanse of the Pacific. "Any visual on the swimmer?" Tom barked into his radio, his eyes never leaving the choppy waters. "Negative, Tower 1, came the crackled response. "No sign of him from our position." Tom cursed under his breath. He'd known something was wrong the moment he spotted Jake swimming far beyond the safe zone. Now, hours later, with no sign of the young swimmer, his worst fears were being realized. "Launch the jet skis," Tom ordered, his voice tight with tension. "I want every inch of that coastline covered, and get the Coast Guard on the horn. We're going to need air support." As his team sprang into action, Tom couldn't shake the gnawing guilt in his gut. He should have done more to stop Jake, should have physically prevented him from entering the water. But he hadn't, and now a life hung in the balance. Miles out to sea, Jake Miller clung desperately to a small red and white buoy, his body battered and bleeding. The shark's last attack had left him disoriented and weak, but some primal instinct for survival kept him holding on. "Help," Jake croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Please. Someone." But there was no one to hear his pleas. The vast, indifferent ocean stretched in every direction, its gentle swells hiding the mortal danger that lurked beneath the surface. Jake's mind, fuzzy from blood loss and exhaustion, drifted to thoughts of his family, his friends, the life he might never see again. Tears mixed with the salt water on his face as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, unsure if he was addressing the ocean, the shark, or some higher power. "I should have listened." A sudden movement in the water jolted Jake back to full alertness. The shark's dorsal fin sliced through the waves, circling ever closer. Jake's heart hammered in his chest, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. "No, no, no," he chanted, gripping the buoy tighter. Please just go away. But the great white, driven by instinct and the scent of blood, had no intention of leaving. It circled closer, its black eye rolling back as it prepared to strike. Back on shore, the rescue operation was in full swing. Jet skis crisscrossed the bay, their riders scanning the waters with desperate intensity. On the beach, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion and the growing realization that a life-or-death drama was unfolding before them. Amidst the chaos, a young couple approached Tom, their faces pale with worry. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice trembling. We think we heard something. Out there." She pointed towards the open water. Tom's attention snapped to them immediately. "What did you hear? When?" The man spoke up, his arm around his partner's shoulders. "It was faint, but it sounded like someone calling for help. Maybe 10-15 minutes ago." Tom's heart raced. It wasn't much, but it was the first lead they'd had all morning. He grabbed his radio, barking orders to redirect the search to the area the couple had indicated. "Thank you," he told them earnestly. "You may have just saved a life." As Tom coordinated the intensified search, a new sound cut through the air, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades. The Coast Guard had arrived. Miles out to sea, Jake was losing his battle with consciousness. The shark had made several passes, each one closer than the last. Jake's legs, mangled from the previous attacks, throbbed with a pain so intense it threatened to overwhelm him. Just as Jake felt his grip on the buoy beginning to loosen, a new sound reached his ears. At first, he thought he was hallucinating, the steady thrum of an engine growing louder by the second. With the last of his strength, Jake raised his head. There, cutting through the waves, was a Coast Guard rescue boat. "Here!" Jake tried to shout, but his voice came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. "I'm here!" The boat drew closer, its crew scanning the waters. Jake waved his arm frantically, praying they would spot him before the shark made its final attack. Suddenly, a shout went up from the boat. "There! Port side!" Jake sobbed with relief as the boat changed course, heading straight for him. But his relief was short-lived. The shark, agitated by the boat's presence, made one final, aggressive lunge. Time seemed to slow. Jake could see every detail with horrifying clarity. The rows of serrated teeth, the scarred snout, the black, lifeless eye rolling back in its head. He braced himself for the inevitable pain, for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, a strong hand grasped his arm, yanking him roughly out of the water. Jake found himself being hauled onto the deck of the rescue boat, gasping and sputtering. "We've got him!" a voice shouted. "He's alive!" As the boat sped back towards shore, the rescue team worked frantically to stabilize Jake. They cut away what remained of his wetsuit, applying pressure to his wounds and wrapping him in thermal blankets. "Stay with us, buddy," one of the rescuers urged, his face a mask of concern. "You're safe now. Just hang on." Jake tried to respond, but no words would come. The world around him seemed to blur and shift, reality mixing with the nightmare he'd been living. He could still feel the shark's presence, could still see its terrifying form circling beneath the waves. "Shark," Jake managed to croak. "There's a shark." The rescuers exchanged worried glances. "He's delirious," one of them muttered, probably in shock. But Jake wasn't delirious. Even as the boat raced back to shore, the great white followed, its primal instincts overriding any fear of the human intruders. It paced the boat, its dorsal fin slicing through the water like a knife. One of the rescuers spotted it first. "Holy shit," he breathed. "He's right. There is a shark." The boat's captain didn't hesitate. "Full throttle," he ordered. "Let's get the hell out of here." As they neared the shore, a crowd had gathered on the beach. Word had spread quickly about the rescue operation, and it seemed like half of Monterey had turned out to witness the drama unfold. Tom stood at the water's edge, his heart in his throat as he watched the rescue boat approach. When he saw Jake's limp form being lifted from the deck, a wave of emotion washed over him, relief, guilt, and a bone-deep weariness. "Get a med evac chopper here now," Tom shouted, already wading into the surf to help bring Jake ashore. As Jake was carried onto the beach, a hush fell over the crowd. The young swimmer's body was a mess of blood and torn flesh, his skin pale and clammy. But he was alive, Against all odds, he had survived. Paramedics swarmed around Jake, working with practiced efficiency to stabilize him for transport. An IV was inserted, monitors attached, his wounds hastily bandaged. Through it all, Jake drifted in and out of consciousness. The faces around him blurred and shifted, sometimes human, sometimes transforming into the terrifying visage of the shark. He tried to speak, to warn them that the danger wasn't over, but no words would come. As Jake was being loaded into the waiting helicopter, Tom approached, his face a mask of concern and relief. "You made it, kid," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "You beat the odds." Jake's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Tom's face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Should've listened." Tom shook his head, fighting back tears. "Don't you worry about that now. Just focus on getting better, you hear me?" As the helicopter lifted off, its rotors kicking up a cloud of sand, Tom turned to face the ocean. The rescue boat was just pulling up to the shore, its crew looking shaken. "You're not going to believe this," one of them said to Tom, "but there was a shark out there. Biggest damn great white I've ever seen." Tom nodded grimly. "I believe it. That kid went through hell out there." As the crowd on the beach began to disperse, Tom couldn't shake the image of Jake's battered body from his mind. The ocean, which had been his home and livelihood for decades, suddenly seemed alien and threatening. "It's not over," Tom muttered to himself, staring out at the seemingly peaceful waves. "For that kid, the real fight is just beginning." In the helicopter, Jake finally succumbed to unconsciousness. But even in the depths of oblivion, he couldn't escape the memory of the shark. Its presence lingered in his mind, a shadow that threatened to engulf him. As the medical team worked to keep him alive, Jake's subconscious grappled with the trauma he had endured. In his mind's eye, he was back in the water, facing the shark. But this time, something was different. Instead of fear, Jake felt a strange sense of calm. He looked the shark in the eye, seeing it not as a monster, but as a creature of nature, powerful, primal, but ultimately just doing what it was born to do. "I see you," Jake whispered in his delirium. "I understand now." The medical team exchanged worried glances, increasing the flow of IV fluids and checking his vitals more frequently. They had seen trauma victims before, had witnessed the strange things the mind could do when pushed to its limits. But there was something different about this young swimmer, something that spoke of a strength and resilience beyond the ordinary. As the helicopter touched down on the hospital helipad, Jake was rushed into emergency surgery. The medical team worked tirelessly, repairing damaged blood vessels, debriding wounded tissue, fighting to save not just Jake's life, but his legs as well. Hours later, as Jake lay in recovery, the head surgeon approached Tom, who had been waiting anxiously in the hospital lobby. "He's stable," the surgeon said, her face showing signs of exhaustion. "It was touch and go for a while, but he's a fighter." Tom nodded, relief washing over him. Will he be able to swim again?" The surgeon's expression turned serious. "It's too early to say for certain. The damage was extensive. He's got a long road ahead of him, but given his physical condition before the attack and his obvious determination, I wouldn't rule anything out." As Tom absorbed this information, he couldn't help but marvel at the resilience of the human spirit. Jake had faced one of nature's most perfect predators and lived to tell the tale. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Tom had a feeling that this young swimmer would face them with the same courage and determination that had kept him alive in the open ocean. The rescue efforts were over, but Jake Miller's journey was just beginning. The shark may have disappeared back into the depths of the Pacific, but its impact would be felt for years to come. For Jake, for Tom, and for all those involved in the dramatic rescue, life would never be quite the same again. As night fell over Monterey Bay, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded in its waters. Somewhere in its depths, a great white shark continued its silent patrol, an apex predator in its natural habitat. And in a hospital room overlooking the bay, a young swimmer began the long, challenging process of healing, not just in body, but in mind and spirit as well. The rescue was complete, but the true test of survival was only just beginning. The rhythmic thrum of the helicopter's rotors filled the air as it sped towards Monterey Bay Hospital. Inside, a team of medical professionals fought desperately to keep Jake Miller alive. The young swimmer's body, battered and torn by the Great White's attack, teetered on the brink of collapse. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead emergency physician on duty, received the incoming transmission from the helicopter. Her face grew grim as she listened to the paramedics' report. Male, 25 years old, severe lacerations to left calf and right thigh, multiple puncture wounds across the torso, significant blood loss. BP is dropping, currently 80-50. Heart rate erratic. Dr. Chen's mind raced as she processed the information. Prep OR1 immediately, she ordered a nearby nurse. And get every available unit of O-negative blood ready. We're going to need it all. As the hospital staff scrambled to prepare for Jake's arrival, the scene inside the helicopter was one of controlled chaos. Paramedics worked feverishly, their hands moving with practiced precision as they fought to stabilize their patient. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, his world a haze of pain and confusion. In his delirium, he was still in the ocean, still fighting for his life against the relentless predator. No. Please, he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the noise of the helicopter. The shark. It's coming back. One of the paramedics, a young woman named Maria, leaned in close. You're safe now, Jake, she said, her voice firm but gentle. The shark is gone. We're taking you to the hospital. But Jake couldn't hear her. In his mind, he was back in the water, the Great White's massive form circling ever closer. He could see every detail with terrifying clarity. The rows of serrated teeth, the black, lifeless eyes, the scars that crisscrossed its snout. It's too big, Jake gasped, his body tensing as if bracing for another attack. I can't fight it. Maria exchanged a worried glance with her colleague. He's going into shock, she said. We need to land now. As if in response to her urgency, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Monterey Bay Hospital, 2 minutes out, prepare for landing. On the hospital's helipad, Dr. Chen and her team waited anxiously. The moment the helicopter touched down, they sprang into action. The doors flew open, and Jake was quickly transferred onto a gurney. What's his status? Dr. Chen demanded as they rushed towards the emergency room. BP's still dropping, Maria reported, jogging alongside the gurney. We've pushed 2 units of O-neg, but he's still unstable. And he's delirious. Keeps talking about the shark. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. Trauma response is normal. Right now, we need to focus on stopping the bleeding and preventing hypovolemic shock. As they burst through the doors of the ER, the scene erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses and doctors swarmed around Jake, each focused on their specific tasks. IVs were inserted, monitors attached, wounds quickly assessed and temporarily bandaged. Through it all, Jake continued to drift between reality and his nightmare. The bright lights and urgent voices of the ER blurred and shifted, sometimes transforming into the murky depths of the Pacific. The faces of the medical staff morphed into the terrifying visage of the shark, causing Jake to cry out and thrash weakly against the hands trying to help him. Hold him still, Dr. Chen ordered as she cut away what remained of Jake's wetsuit. The extent of his injuries became fully apparent, drawing sharp intakes of breath from even the most experienced staff members. Jake's left calf was a mangled mess of torn flesh and exposed muscle. His right thigh bore deep, jagged lacerations that spoke of the immense power behind the shark's bite. Across his torso, smaller puncture wounds and scrapes told the story of his desperate struggle for survival. We need to get him to the OR now, Dr. Chen declared. He's losing blood faster than we can replace it. As they prepared to move Jake to surgery, a commotion at the ER entrance drew their attention. Tom, the lifeguard who had initiated the rescue, burst in, his face a mask of worry and guilt. How is he? Tom demanded, his eyes wild as he scanned the room. Is he going to make it? A nurse intercepted him before he could get closer. Sir, you need to wait outside. The doctors are doing everything they can. Tom's shoulders slumped, the adrenaline that had carried him through the rescue into the hospital finally wearing off. I should have stopped him, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. I knew it was dangerous, but I let him go. As Tom was gently but firmly guided to the waiting area, Jake was being wheeled towards the operating room. Dr. Chen walked alongside, barking orders and reviewing the plan of action with her surgical team. "We'll start with the leg wounds," she said. "They're the most immediate threat. We need to repair the damaged blood vessels and debride the necrotic tissue. Once he's stable, we'll address the other injuries." The OR doors swung open, and the team sprang into action. The next several hours were a blur of intense concentration and precise movements. Dr. Chen and her team worked tirelessly, their focus unwavering as they fought to save not just Jake's life, but his legs as well. Outside in the waiting room, Tom paced restlessly. He was joined by Jake's parents, who had arrived shortly after being notified. The atmosphere was tense, filled with unspoken fears and desperate hope. "He's always been so careful in the water," Jake's mother said, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't understand how this could have happened." Tom felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. "It's my fault," he admitted, unable to meet their eyes. "I saw him swimming out too far. I should have done more to stop him." Jake's father placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "You can't blame yourself," he said, his voice gruff with suppressed emotion. "Jake's an adult. He made his own choice." The hours crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity to those waiting for news. Finally, after what seemed like an age, Dr. Chen emerged from the OR, her scrubs spattered with blood and her face etched with exhaustion. "He's alive," she announced, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the room. "It was touch and go for a while, but he's stable now. We've managed to repair the major damage to his legs, though he'll need several more surgeries and extensive physical therapy." Jake's mother sobbed with relief, clinging to her husband. Tom felt his knees go weak, and he had to sit down abruptly. "When can we see him?" Jake's father asked, his arm around his wife. "He's being moved to the ICU now," Dr. Chen replied. "You can see him briefly in about an hour, but I must warn you, he's still in critical condition. The next 24 hours will be crucial." As the group absorbed this information, a young marine biologist who had been waiting quietly in the corner approached Dr. Chen. "Excuse me, doctor," she said. "I'm Dr. Emma Rodriguez from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. When Mr. Miller is able, we'd very much like to speak with him about his encounter. It could provide valuable data for our shark research and conservation efforts." Dr. Chen nodded wearily. "I understand, but Mr. Miller's health and recovery must be our primary concern right now. It may be several days before he's able to speak coherently about his experience." As promised, an hour later, Jake's parents were allowed a brief visit to the ICU. They found their son lying motionless in a hospital bed, his body a patchwork of bandages and tubes. The steady beep of the heart monitor provided a small measure of comfort, a constant reminder that despite everything, Jake was still fighting. "Oh, Jake," his mother whispered, gently taking his hand. "We're here, sweetheart. You're safe now." Jake stirred slightly at the sound of her voice, his eyelids fluttering but not opening. His lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. His father leaned in closer. "What is it, son? What are you trying to say?" "The shark," Jake mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's still out there." Jake's parents exchanged worried glances, unsure how to respond to their son's delirious statement. Outside the ICU, Tom sat slumped in a chair, his face buried in his hands. A passing nurse paused, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You should go home and rest," she said gently. "There's nothing more you can do here tonight." Tom looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "I can't leave," he said. "Not until I know he's going to be okay. I owe him that much." As night fell over Monterey Bay, the hospital settled into the quieter rhythms of its nocturnal routine. In the ICU, Jake slept fitfully, his dreams a chaotic mix of memory and nightmare. The heart monitor beeped steadily, a constant reminder of the fragile thread that tethered him to life. Miles away, out in the deep waters of the Pacific, a great white shark continued its silent patrol. Unaware of the drama it had sparked, the apex predator moved through its watery domain with the same primal grace it had possessed for millions of years. The race against time had been won, for now. Jake Miller had survived the initial attack and the grueling hours of surgery that followed. But his journey was far from over. The real challenge, recovering not just physically, but mentally from his ordeal, was only just beginning. As a new day dawned, bringing with it the promise of healing and the specter of a long, difficult recovery, one thing was certain. Life for Jake Miller and for all those touched by his harrowing experience would never be the same again. The dawn broke over Monterey Bay, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. The ocean, which had been the stage for such drama just days before, now appeared calm and innocent. But for those involved in Jake Miller's rescue and recovery, the peaceful scene was a stark contrast to the turmoil that continued to unfold within the walls of Monterey Bay Hospital. In the intensive care unit, Jake lay motionless, his body a patchwork of bandages and tubes. The steady beep of the heart monitor provided a rhythmic backdrop to the hushed conversations of the medical staff. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the foot of Jake's bed, reviewing his chart with a furrowed brow. "How's he doing, doctor?" asked Nurse Rodriguez, who had been keeping a vigilant eye on Jake throughout the night. Dr. Chen sighed, running a hand through her hair. "He's stable but still critical. The next 24 hours will be crucial. We need to watch for any signs of infection or further complications." As they spoke, Jake stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. Dr. Chen moved quickly to his side, leaning in close. "Jake, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Jake's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and clouded with confusion. His lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. "What is it, Jake?" Dr. Chen urged, leaning closer. "The shark," Jake whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "It's still out there." Dr. Chen exchanged a worried glance with Nurse Rodriguez. "You're safe now, Jake," she assured him. "You're in the hospital. The shark can't hurt you anymore." But Jake's eyes had already closed again, his brief moment of consciousness fading as quickly as it had come. Dr. Chen made a note in his chart, her concern growing. "We need to keep a close eye on his mental state," she told Nurse Rodriguez. "The physical trauma is severe, but the psychological impact of an experience like this can be just as debilitating." Outside in the waiting room, Tom, the lifeguard who had coordinated Jake's rescue, sat slumped in an uncomfortable plastic chair. He hadn't left the hospital since Jake had been brought in, his guilt and worry keeping him rooted to the spot. Jake's parents, Michael and Lisa Miller, entered the waiting room, their faces drawn with exhaustion and worry. They spotted Tom and approached him. "Any news?" Michael asked, his voice rough with fatigue. Tom shook his head. "Nothing new. They say he's stable, but..." He trailed off, unable to voice the fears that plagued him. Lisa sank into the chair next to Tom, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You need to go home and rest, Tom. You've been here for days." Tom shook his head vehemently. "I can't leave. Not until I know he's going to be okay. This is my fault. I should have stopped him from going out so far." Michael's face hardened. "This isn't your fault, Tom. Jake made his own choice. He knew the risks." Before Tom could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Emma Rodriguez, the marine biologist from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. She approached the group hesitantly, aware of the tension in the air. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller?" she asked. When they nodded, she continued, "I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I was hoping I might be able to speak with you about Jake's encounter." Michael's expression turned wary. "What do you want to know?" Dr. Rodriguez took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I understand this is a difficult time, but Jake's experience could provide invaluable data for our shark research and conservation efforts. If he's willing, once he's recovered enough, we'd like to interview him about what happened." Lisa's eyes flashed with anger. "Conservation efforts? That monster nearly killed our son." Dr. Rodriguez held up her hands placatingly. "I understand your anger, Mrs. Miller, but great white sharks play a crucial role in our ocean's ecosystem. They're not monsters, just predators doing what nature designed them to do." Tom stood up abruptly, his face pale. "I need some air," he muttered, hurrying out of the waiting room. Outside, Tom leaned against the hospital wall, taking deep breaths of the cool morning air. The events of the past few days played on repeat in his mind. Jake ignoring his warning, the frantic search, the horrifying moment when they'd pulled his mangled body from the water. A hand on his shoulder startled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Dr. Chen standing beside him, her face etched with concern. "You look like you could use this," she said, offering him a cup of coffee. Tom accepted it gratefully, taking a long sip before speaking. "How is he really?" he asked, dreading the answer. Dr. Chen's expression turned serious. "He's fighting hard," she said. "The physical injuries are severe, but what worries me more is the psychological trauma. He keeps talking about the shark, even in his sleep. It's going to be a long road to recovery, both physically and mentally." Tom nodded, guilt washing over him anew. Will he ever be able to swim again?" Dr. Chen hesitated before answering. "It's too early to say for certain. The damage to his legs was extensive. He'll need multiple surgeries and intensive physical therapy. But if anyone can do it, I believe Jake can. The strength he showed in surviving the attack, it's remarkable." As they stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, a commotion from inside the hospital caught their attention. They rushed back to the ICU to find Jake thrashing in his bed, his monitors beeping frantically. "No! Get away!" Jake was shouting, his eyes wide with terror but unseeing. "The shark! It's coming back!" Dr. Chen rushed to his side, trying to calm him. "Jake, it's okay, you're safe. There's no shark here." But Jake couldn't hear her. In his mind, he was back in the ocean, the great white circling ever closer. His thrashing intensified, threatening to tear open his wounds. "We need to sedate him," Dr. Chen ordered, her voice tight with urgency. As the medical team worked to stabilize Jake, his parents watched from the doorway, their faces etched with horror and helplessness. "Oh, Michael," Lisa sobbed, burying her face in her husband's chest. "What if he never gets better? What if he's like this forever?" Michael held her tightly, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He'll get through this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll help him through this. Our boy is strong." Hours later, after Jake had been sedated and stabilized, Dr. Chen met with his parents and Tom in a small conference room. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," she began, her face serious. "Jake's road to recovery is going to be long and difficult. The physical injuries will heal with time and therapy, but the psychological trauma, that's going to be the real challenge." "What can we do?" Michael asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Be patient," Dr. Chen advised. "Be supportive. And most importantly, be prepared for setbacks. Recovery from an experience like this isn't linear. There will be good days and bad days." As the group absorbed this information, a knock at the door interrupted them. A police officer entered, his face grave. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, "but we need to take an official statement about the incident." Tom stood up, his face pale but determined. "I'll do it," he said. "I was the one on duty. I saw it all." As Tom left with the officer, Dr. Rodriguez approached Jake's parents once more. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she began hesitantly. "I know this isn't the best time, but I was hoping we could discuss the possibility of using Jake's experience to educate the public about shark behavior and ocean safety." Lisa's eyes flashed with anger again, but Michael placed a calming hand on her arm. "How would that work? Exactly?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Dr. Rodriguez's face lit up with enthusiasm. "We could create an exhibit at the aquarium, detailing Jake's encounter and survival. It could help people understand these creatures better and potentially prevent future incidents." Lisa shook her head vehemently. "Absolutely not. I won't have my son's trauma turned into a circus attraction." "I understand your reservations," Dr. Rodriguez said quickly, "but think about the lives it could save. Jake's story could teach others how to stay safe in the ocean, how to recognize potential dangers." Before either of Jake's parents could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. They rushed out to find Jake's room a flurry of activity, doctors and nurses swarming around his bed. "What's happening?" Lisa cried, trying to push her way into the room. Dr. Chen intercepted her, her face grim. "Jake's developed a fever," she explained quickly. "We're concerned about infection setting in. We need to take him back into surgery to clean the wounds and administer stronger antibiotics." As Jake was wheeled rapidly towards the operating room, his parents could only watch helplessly. The beeping of the monitors, the urgent voices of the medical staff, all blended into a cacophony of fear and uncertainty. Hours passed like days as Jake's family and friends waited for news. Tom paced the waiting room restlessly, while Michael and Lisa sat hand in hand, their faces etched with worry. Finally, Dr. Chen emerged. her surgical cap still on and dark circles under her eyes. "He's stable," she announced, and a collective sigh of relief filled the room. "We've managed to clean out the infection and start him on a powerful course of antibiotics. The next 48 hours will be critical, but I'm cautiously optimistic." As the group absorbed this news, Dr. Rodriguez approached once more, her face apologetic. "I'm sorry to bring this up again," she began, "but I've been in touch with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're very interested in Jake's case. It could provide valuable data for their shark monitoring and beach safety programs." Michael looked at her thoughtfully. "You really think Jake's story could make a difference?" Dr. Rodriguez nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. It could help us understand shark behavior better, improve our warning systems, maybe even develop new safety measures for swimmers and surfers." Lisa looked torn, her initial anger warring with the potential to create something positive from their ordeal. "We'll think about it," Michael said finally. "But our priority right now is Jake's recovery." As the days passed, Jake's condition slowly improved. The fever broke and he began to have longer periods of lucidity. But with increasing awareness came the full realization of what had happened to him. One afternoon, as Jake lay in his hospital bed staring out the window at the distant ocean, Tom entered the room hesitantly. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" Jake turned to look at him, his eyes haunted. "I keep seeing it," he whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, it's there. Those teeth, those eyes." Tom moved to sit by the bed, his heart heavy. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I should have stopped you from going out so far." Jake shook his head weakly. "It's not your fault, Tom. I made my own choice. I never thought it could happen to me, you know." As they sat in companionable silence, Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, a tentative smile on her face. "Jake?" she said softly. "I'm Dr. Rodriguez from the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I was wondering if you might feel up to talking about your experience." Jake's face paled, and his heart rate monitor began to beat more rapidly. Tom stood up, positioning himself protectively between Jake and the door. "I don't think now's a good time," he said firmly. But Jake's voice, weak but determined, surprised them both. "No, it's okay," he said. "I'll talk about it. If it can help prevent this from happening to someone else, then I want to do it." Dr. Rodriguez entered the room, her face a mixture of sympathy and scientific curiosity. "Thank you, Jake," she said sincerely. "I know this isn't easy. Can you tell me what you remember about the shark? Any details about its behavior, its size?" Jake closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, they were filled with a mix of fear and something else, a determination to face his trauma head-on. "It was massive," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bigger than I ever imagined a shark could be. Its skin was like sandpaper when it brushed against me, and its eyes, they were so black, so empty, but at the same time there was an intelligence there. It wasn't just attacking blindly, it was hunting me." As Jake continued to recount his experience, Tom and Dr. Rodriguez listened in rapt attention. The terror of the attack was evident in every word, but so too was Jake's incredible will to survive. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Dr. Rodriguez cleared her throat, visibly moved. "Thank you, Jake," she said softly. "Your account will be invaluable to our research. And your courage, it's truly remarkable." As Dr. Rodriguez left, promising to return for more detailed interviews when Jake felt up to it, Tom turned to the young swimmer. "You okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so. It was, hard talking about it, but it also felt good, you know? Like I'm taking back some control." Over the next few weeks, Jake's recovery continued. Physical therapy sessions left him exhausted and often frustrated, but he pushed through with grim determination. The nightmares persisted, but with the help of a trauma counselor, he slowly began to develop coping mechanisms. One day, as Jake sat in a wheelchair by the window of his hospital room, gazing out at the ocean, his parents entered with Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez. "Jake," his father began, "we've been talking and..." Well, we think it might be a good idea to share your story, to help others understand the risks, and maybe prevent something like this from happening again. Jake turned to look at them, his face thoughtful. You mean like an exhibit at the aquarium, Doctor? Rodriguez nodded eagerly. That's one possibility. We could also develop educational programs, maybe even a documentary. Your experience could save lives, Jake. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the distant ocean. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but resolute. Okay, he said. Let's do it, but on one condition. What's that, honey? His mother asked. Jake turned back to face them, a spark of his old determination in his eyes. I want to swim again, not just in a pool, but in the ocean. I need to face my fear, to prove to myself that I can do it. The room fell silent, the adults exchanging worried glances. It was Dr. Chen who finally spoke. It won't be easy, Jake, she said gently. Your injuries were severe. It will take a lot of work, a lot of therapy. Jake nodded. I know, but I have to try. The ocean, it's been a part of me for so long. I can't let the shark take that away. As the sun set over Monterey Bay, casting a golden glow across the water, Jake's words hung in the air. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with physical and emotional challenges. But in that moment, surrounded by those who cared for him, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. The shark may have taken much from him, but it hadn't taken everything. His spirit, his determination, his love for the ocean. These remained. And with them, the possibility of not just recovery, but of transformation. The aftermath of the attack would continue to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the shores of Monterey Bay. But for Jake Miller, the most important journey was just beginning. The journey back to himself, and back to the water that had always been his home. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Jake Miller's eyes snapped open. For a moment, disorientation gripped him as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings of his bedroom. It had been 3 weeks since his discharge from the hospital, but the transition back home still felt surreal. Jake pushed himself up, wincing at the dull ache that radiated through his legs. His gaze fell on the wheelchair positioned next to his bed, a constant reminder of how much his life had changed. With a deep breath, he began the arduous process of transferring himself from the bed to the chair. You've got this, he muttered, gritting his teeth against the pain, one day at a time. As Jake maneuvered his wheelchair down the hallway, the smell of coffee and bacon wafted from the kitchen. He found his mother, Lisa, bustling around, her face lighting up as he entered. Good morning, sweetheart, she said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. How are you feeling today? Jake managed a small smile. I'm okay, Mom. Just the usual aches and pains. Lisa's eyes clouded with concern, but she quickly masked it. Well, I've made your favorite breakfast. And don't forget, you have physical therapy at 10. Jake nodded, his appetite diminishing at the thought of another grueling session. The physical pain was intense, but it paled in comparison to the mental struggle he faced every day. As they ate in silence, Jake's mind wandered to the ocean. From the kitchen window, he could see a sliver of Monterey Bay in the distance. Once his sanctuary, it now loomed in his mind like a threat. I think I'll go out on the deck for a bit, Jake said, pushing away from the table. Lisa watched him go, her heart heavy. She wanted to help, to take away his pain, but she felt helpless in the face of his trauma. Outside, Jake positioned his wheelchair to face the ocean. The morning breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and seaweed, stirring memories both comforting and terrifying. You don't own me, Jake whispered to the distant waves. I won't let you win. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Moments later, he heard his mother's voice. Jake, Tom's here to see you. Jake turned to see Tom, the lifeguard who had coordinated his rescue, step onto the deck. The older man's face was etched with a mixture of concern and guilt that had become all too familiar. Hey, kid, Tom said, settling into a chair next to Jake. How are you holding up? Jake shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Taking it day by day, I guess. They sat in companionable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Tom spoke. I talked to Dr. Rodriguez yesterday. She's still hoping you'll consider participating in that education program at the aquarium. Jake tensed, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. I don't know, Tom. Talking about it makes it all feel so real again. Tom nodded, understanding. I get it, Jake. But your story, it could make a real difference. Help people understand the risks, maybe even save lives. Before Jake could respond, his mother appeared in the doorway. Jake, honey, it's time to leave for PT. The physical therapy center was a place of both hope and frustration for Jake. Each small victory was celebrated, but the road ahead seemed impossibly long. All right, Jake, his therapist Maria said with an encouraging smile. Let's see how those legs are doing today. For the next hour, Jake pushed himself to the limit. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled through exercises designed to rebuild his strength and mobility. Each movement sent shockwaves of pain through his body, but he refused to give up. You're doing great, Maria encouraged as Jake took tentative steps between the parallel bars. Just a few more. Jake's arms shook with the effort of supporting his weight, his damaged legs trembling beneath him. Just as he neared the end of the bars, a sudden flash of memory hit him. The feeling of the shark's teeth sinking into his flesh, the terror of being pulled underwater. With a cry of panic, Jake's legs gave out. He would have crashed to the floor if Maria hadn't caught him. It's okay, Jake, she soothed, helping him back into his wheelchair. You're safe. You're not in the water. The shark isn't here. Jake nodded, his breath coming in short gasps as he fought to calm himself. These flashbacks had become a regular occurrence, striking without warning and leaving him shaken. As Maria went to get him some water, Jake overheard a conversation from the other side of the room. Did you hear? That's the guy who survived the shark attack, a voice whispered. No way. I heard he was practically torn in half, another replied. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voices. He was tired of being the shark attack guy, tired of the pitying looks and whispered conversations. The ride home was silent. Jake lost in his thoughts as his mother navigated the coastal road. As they passed a beach, Jake noticed a group of surfers heading into the waves. A pang of longing mixed with fear shot through him. Mom, he said suddenly, can we stop for a minute? Surprised, Lisa pulled into the beach parking lot. Jake opened his door, the sound of crashing waves filling the car. I want to go down to the sand, he said, determination in his voice. Lisa hesitated. Are you sure, honey? Your wheelchair won't work well on the sand. I know, Jake replied. I want to try walking. With Lisa's help, Jake made his way slowly down to the beach. Each step was a struggle, the soft sand making his already unsteady gait even more precarious. But the feeling of being back on the beach, of facing his fear head-on, gave him strength. They stopped at the edge of the wet sand, the waves lapping just feet away. Jake stood there, supported by his mother, staring out at the vast expanse of the Pacific. I used to feel so at home out there, he said softly. Now it terrifies me. Lisa squeezed his hand. It's okay to be scared, Jake. After what you went through, anyone would be. Jake nodded, tears stinging his eyes. But I don't want to be scared forever, Mom. I want to get back in the water someday. I need to. As they stood there, a young boy ran past them, heading straight for the waves with a boogie board tucked under his arm. His mother called out after him, Be careful, Tommy, don't go out too far. The scene struck a chord in Jake. He thought of all the other swimmers and surfers out there, many of them unaware of the potential dangers lurking beneath the surface. I think, Jake said slowly, I think I want to do that program at the aquarium after all. Lisa looked at him in surprise. Are you sure? Jake nodded, a new resolve settling over him. If my story can help keep other people safe, then maybe some good can come out of all this. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Rodriguez and her team from the Monterey Bay Aquarium visited Jake at home, working with him to develop the educational program. We want to strike a balance, Dr. Rodriguez explained as they sat around the dining room table. We need to convey the seriousness of shark encounters without demonizing these important creatures or scaring people away from the ocean entirely. Jake nodded, looking over the outline they had created. I think that's important. The shark, it wasn't evil. It was just doing what nature designed it to do. I was in its territory. As they worked, Jake found that talking about his experience became slightly easier each time. The memories were still painful, but sharing them felt cathartic in a way he hadn't expected. The day of the program's debut arrived all too quickly. Jake sat in his wheelchair backstage at the aquarium's auditorium, his heart racing as he listened to the murmur of the gathering crowd. Tom appeared at his side, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this, kid. Remember, you're the strongest person in that room." You stared death in the face and came out the other side. Jake managed a shaky smile. "Thanks, Tom. I just hope I don't freeze up out there." As Dr. Rodriguez introduced him to the audience, Jake took a deep breath and wheeled himself onto the stage. The bright lights momentarily blinded him, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw the sea of faces looking back at him. Some curious, some apprehensive, all attentive. "Good morning," Jake began, his voice wavering slightly. "My name is Jake Miller, and 6 weeks ago, I survived an encounter with a great white shark right here in Monterey Bay." As Jake recounted his experience, he could see the impact his words were having on the audience. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd at particularly harrowing moments. But more importantly, he saw understanding dawning on many faces. The shark wasn't a monster, Jake emphasized. It was a predator in its natural habitat. I was the intruder. But that doesn't mean we can't coexist. With the right knowledge and precautions, we can minimize the risk of encounters like mine. After the presentation, as Jake answered questions from the audience, he felt a shift within himself. The fear was still there, but it no longer consumed him. By facing his trauma head-on, by using it to help others, he had taken back some of the power the attack had stolen from him. As the weeks turned into months, Jake's recovery continued. Physical therapy remained a challenge, but he attacked each session with renewed determination. Slowly but surely, he regained strength and mobility in his legs. The nightmares and flashbacks didn't disappear entirely, but they became less frequent, less intense. Jake worked with a trauma counselor, developing coping strategies and gradually processing his experience. 6 months after the attack, Jake stood on the beach once again. This time, he didn't need support to walk across the sand. His gait was still uneven and scars crisscrossed his legs, but he moved under his own power. Tom stood beside him, both of them watching the waves roll in. "You've come a long way, kid," the lifeguard said, pride evident in his voice. Jake nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I couldn't have done it without you, Tom. Without all of you." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of the waves washing over them. Finally, Jake spoke again. "I think I'm ready," he said softly. Tom looked at him sharply. "Ready for what?" Jake took a deep breath. "To get back in the water." Tom's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "There's no rush, Jake. No one would blame you if you never wanted to swim in the ocean again." "I'm sure," Jake replied, a spark of his old determination shining in his eyes. "I need to do this, Tom. For me." With slow, deliberate steps, Jake made his way down to the water's edge. He paused as the first wave washed over his feet, the cool water sending a shiver through him that had nothing to do with temperature. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. His heart raced, and his breath came in short gasps. But Jake closed his eyes, focusing on the techniques his counselor had taught him. "You're safe," he whispered to himself. "You're in control. The shark isn't here." Gradually, his breathing steadied. Jake opened his eyes and took another step into the surf, then another, and another. Soon he was waist-deep in the water. The waves pushed and pulled at him, but Jake stood firm. He looked out at the vast expanse of the Pacific, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Fear, yes, but also exhilaration, pride, and a sense of homecoming. From the shore, Tom watched with a lump in his throat as Jake began to swim. His strokes were hesitant at first, but grew stronger and more confident with each passing moment. Jake Miller would never forget the day a great white shark nearly took his life. The scars on his body and mind would remain with him always, but as he floated on his back staring up at the endless blue sky, Jake realized something profound. The shark had taken much from him, but it hadn't taken everything. His spirit, his determination, his love for the ocean, these remained intact. In fact, they had been tempered by his ordeal, made stronger in the crucible of his recovery. As Jake made his way back to shore, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The ocean, vast and powerful, had nearly claimed his life. But it had also given him a second chance, a new perspective, and a purpose. The scars remained, both physical and emotional, but they no longer defined him. They were simply part of his story, a story of survival, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit. Jake Miller had faced his greatest fear and emerged changed, but undefeated. As he stepped back onto the sand, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The ocean, once his adversary, was once again his home.